40 shots of vodka. That is what the coroner found in John Bonham's system on the morning of September 25, 1980. A road manager walked down a hallway at Jimmy Page's estate in Windsor, opened a bedroom door, and Led Zeppelin ended in that moment. He was 32 years old. The band had a North American tour scheduled. Tickets had been sold. Stadiums across the United States were already booked and waiting. None of it would ever happen. What unfolded in that house in the final hours of John Bonham's life was not a sudden collapse. It was the end of something that had been building for years, and almost everyone around him had seen it coming. This is the story of September 24 and 25, 1980. The last 2 days of Led Zeppelin. By late summer of 1980, Led Zeppelin was preparing for its most ambitious return in years. The second half of the 1970s had been defined by tragedy. Robert Plant's near-fatal car accident in Greece in 1975, the death of his 5-year-old son Kerak in 1977, the abrupt collapse of the 1977 North American tour. The band had gone quiet. Then, in 1979, they returned with In Through the Outdoor and performed 2 sold-out nights at Knebworth House in front of more than 200,000 people. The world had not forgotten Led Zeppelin. Now, in September 1980, rehearsals were underway at Bray Studios in Windsor. Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, John Paul Jones, and John Bonham were preparing to take the stage again. Everything pointed forward. What no one said openly was that John Bonham had been drinking more heavily than ever. On September 24, 1980, John Bonham arrived at Bray Studios for rehearsal. By most accounts, he had already consumed alcohol before he walked through the door. Throughout the session, he reportedly drank the equivalent of 4 quadruple measures of vodka, approximately 16 standard shots, before the afternoon was over. Those present later described him as visibly impaired, struggling at times to maintain the force and precision that had made him the most celebrated drummer in rock music. The rehearsal continued. No intervention was made. In the world Led Zeppelin had inhabited for more than a decade, excess was familiar territory, a problem to be managed around, not confronted. What felt, in the moment, like just another difficult afternoon would later be understood as the final hours of the band's working life. No one in that studio knew it yet. But the clock had already run out. After rehearsal, the group traveled to Jimmy Page's home, Old Mill House, in the village of Clewar, near Windsor. Bonham continued drinking through the evening. At some point, he fell asleep on a couch. Road manager Benji LeFevre and assistant Rex King helped him to a bedroom and positioned him on his side, a precaution those around him had likely taken before. It was an act of routine care, not alarm. The house settled into quiet. Others went to sleep. No one returned to check on him during the night. Outside, England moved through an ordinary September evening. Cars on the road, lights in neighboring windows. Inside Old Mill House, in that second-floor bedroom, John Bonham had consumed more alcohol than the human body is built to survive. No one in the house understood that yet. They would by morning. What happened in that bedroom between the late hours of September 24 and the early morning of September 25 was witnessed by no one. The house was silent. There was no sound of distress, no call for help, no movement that reached anyone sleeping nearby. At some point during those hours, Bonham's body could no longer protect itself. The volume of alcohol in his system had suppressed his reflexes beyond recovery. He aspirated, his airway became obstructed, and he did not wake. There was no struggle. There was no moment of alarm. There was simply a man who had gone to sleep and a body that quietly stopped. He was 32 years old, in the home of one of his closest friends, on the eve of a world tour that months of preparation had made possible. The house remained still until morning. On the morning of September 25, 1980, road manager Benji LeFevre went to check on John Bonham. He found him in the bedroom where he had been left the night before. Emergency services were called immediately, but there was nothing medicine could do. John Henry Bonham, Bonzo, as everyone who knew him called him, was gone. John Paul Jones was notified. Then Robert Plant. Then Jimmy Page. The news moved through that house with the weight of something irreversible. The man who had been the physical and emotional engine of Led Zeppelin for 12 years, whose drumming had stopped radio listeners in 1969, whose footwork on Moby Dick had silenced arenas, had died in his sleep. Alone? In a borrowed room? At an age when most musicians are only reaching their creative peak? The formal inquest into John Bonham's death was conducted in the weeks that followed. The coroner's findings were straightforward and devastating in their simplicity. Bonham had consumed the equivalent of 40 measures of vodka in the 24 hours before his death. His blood alcohol concentration was recorded at 0.4 milligrams per milliliter, more than 5 times the legal driving limit in the United Kingdom. The cause of death was confirmed as pulmonary edema caused by asphyxiation. No illegal substances were found in his system. There was no indication of any other medical event. The verdict was accidental death. 40 measures of vodka, 1 night of sleep from which he did not wake, and the most powerful band in rock history without its center. The inquest took less time to conclude than one of Bonham's drum solos. News of John Bonham's death broke publicly on September 25, 1980, and the response across the rock world was immediate. Radio stations in the United States and the United Kingdom interrupted scheduled programming to announce it. Fans gathered outside record stores and concert venues. In cities where Led Zeppelin had performed, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, people stood in the street holding records they had owned for years, unable to articulate what they felt, but unwilling to be alone with it. For a generation that had grown up with Led Zeppelin as the sound of everything that mattered, the news did not arrive as information. It arrived as a physical blow. Rock music had lost extraordinary artists before, but there was only one John Bonham. Everyone understood that immediately, even those who could not yet say why. In the days that followed, Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, and John Paul Jones said almost nothing publicly. There were no press conferences. Those close to the 3 men described them as people in a state of private collapse, not simply grieving a colleague, but trying to understand who they were without the fourth of them. Plant, who had buried his 5-year-old son just 3 years earlier, carried a relationship with grief that went beyond what most people ever know. Jones, always the quietest member, withdrew completely. Page, who had spent more than a decade building Led Zeppelin into something that transcended rock music, now faced a question he had never allowed himself to consider. What did Led Zeppelin mean without the man who drove it from behind a drum kit every night? In the months and years that followed, accounts emerged, quietly, from those who had worked closely with the band, of how clearly the signs had been visible. Former crew members described Bonham's drinking in the late 1970s as something everyone around the band was aware of, and no one addressed directly. There had been difficult nights on the 1977 North American tour. There had been mornings that were impossible to recover from. The culture inside which Led Zeppelin operated was one in which the line between excess and catastrophe was rarely drawn clearly. Whether anyone attempted a serious intervention, whether any direct conversation about Bonham's drinking ever took place in those final years, has never been answered in any documented account. What is known is this: on September 24th, 1980, at Bray Studios, no one stopped him. For 10 weeks after John Bonham's death, Led Zeppelin made no public statement about their future. Then, on December 4th, 1980, a statement was released on behalf of the band. It read, in part, "We wish it to be known that the loss of our dear friend and the deep sense of undivided harmony felt by ourselves and our manager have led us to decide that we could not continue as we were." There was no farewell concert, no final album, no goodbye from a stage. Led Zeppelin, the band that had sold out Madison Square Garden, that had drawn over 200,000 people to Nebworth the previous summer, that had permanently altered the sound of rock music, ended with a single typed statement. 10 weeks. One paragraph. That was all. The North American tour that John Bonham never reached had 19 dates scheduled across the United States and Canada. Those shows were never rescheduled. The venues sat empty on the nights they were supposed to be filled with sound. But the loss extended beyond canceled dates. Led Zeppelin had been in a period of genuine creative momentum going into 1980. There had been discussions about new material. Page had ideas. Plant had returned emotionally and artistically from the worst years of his life. Jones was, as always, ready. What the next chapter of Led Zeppelin might have sounded like, what direction they would have taken into the decade ahead, exists only as a question with no answer. Rock music has always had great bands. It had exactly one Led Zeppelin. And that morning, in September, ended it. John Bonham left behind his wife Pat and 2 children, a daughter named Zoe and a son named Jason, who was 12 years old when his father died. Jason grew up inside his father's legacy, learning the drums from recordings, studying the patterns that had made John Bonham the standard against which every rock drummer would be measured. In 2007, when Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, and John Paul Jones agreed to perform a one-night reunion concert at London's O2 Arena in tribute to Atlantic Records founder Ahmet Ertegun, there was only one person they considered for the drums. Jason Bonham took the stage in front of 18,000 people. Nearly 1 million had applied for the available tickets. He was 31 years old, 1 year younger than his father had been on the morning of September 25, 1980. He played every note. He cried at the end. John Bonham has been ranked the greatest rock drummer in history by nearly every major music publication that has attempted the list: Rolling Stone, Modern Drummer, and others across 5 decades. The technique he developed, raw physical power combined with musical intelligence and an instinctive understanding of dynamics, has never been replicated in a way that satisfies anyone who heard the original. What set Bonham apart was not just how hard he played, or how fast, or how musically. It was that he understood the drums to be not the foundation beneath the music, but the emotional center of it. When Bonham played, the drums did not support Led Zeppelin. They drove it. They decided where it went and how hard it landed. When he was gone, that force, that specific, irreplaceable force, went with him permanently. John Bonham was 32 years old. He left behind a body of work that has defined what rock music can be for more than half a century, and a silence that has never been filled. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Led Zeppelin Vault. Every week, we go behind the records and the arena lights to find the human moments that define this band. The nights that changed everything. The stories history tends to pass over. Leave a comment below. Tell us what John Bonham meant to you, or what you remember about the first time you heard Led Zeppelin. We read every one, and next week we go deeper.